Hello and welcome to this edition of the ILO's Future of Work podcast. I'm Sophie Fisher. This month, the International Labour Conference, which brings together the ILO's 187 member states, will be meeting. One of the items on the agenda will be the issue of inequality. The topic is particularly relevant right now as policymakers plan for recovery because research by the ILO and many other organisations found that during the COVID-19 crisis, inequality got worse. Existing inequalities deepened and new inequalities emerged. Now, when looking at inequality and ways of tackling it, one important element is wages or income, and this is an area on which the ILO has done some interesting work. With me now is Patrick Belser, senior economist and wage expert at the ILO in Geneva. Patrick, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sophie.
Patrick, let me start with a really basic question, which is, why does inequality matter?
Well, I think inequality is very important. There has always been some level of inequality between people because obviously we're not one and the same, and people have different abilities and people make different choices. So some level of inequality is a fact of life. But when inequality is very high, it's definitely very bad for people and for societies. And that has been increasingly documented by academics, by different organizations. And obviously, it hurts people. It hurts people to have to live in poverty and to not be able to afford a decent lifestyle for their children, when at the same time they see other people who enjoy a very comfortable life and buy houses and 3 cars. And the poor people see that the money is there, but it's not for them. And so they struggle while other people seem to have a very comfortable life. So you have when you have these different realities for different people, you have also societies that tend to fall apart when people live in different bubbles.
And just so we know exactly what we're talking about, what's the difference between income inequality and wage inequality? Because they're not quite the same, are they?
No, there are different concepts. Wages is one source of income. It's really what people get in exchange of their work from their employers. So you need to be a wage employee, a salaried person, and then you receive a wage. And the wage is what you get in exchange for the hours of work that you put in for the employer. But of course, that's not the only source of income for people and families. Some people work and don't have an employer, so these are the self-employed people. And we know that in developing countries, many people work in the informal economy where they are self-employed. You have also people who work on digital platforms who don't have a status of wage employees. But then, of course, people also have their own land or their own capital, and they receive incomes from these things, from land and capital. Or people can also get income from the state, so it's through social transfers, social security. So wage inequality is really what happens in the market when people are in the labor market, in the world of work. Whereas the income inequality is really a broader notion, which is normally also measured at the level of families, because normally you share your income within a household or a family.
So wage inequality applies to those who are formally employed in the ILO definition of formal employment. Is that right?
It's many of the wage employees are formally employed, but you have also wage employees in informal enterprises, for example, or you can also have situations of casual wage workers in India, for example. This is the case where people are recruited in the morning and they work for one day. They are not formal, but nonetheless they have an employer. Somebody recruits them and pays them for the job that they do. So you have a lot of wage workers in the informal economy as well, in fact.
So, how does wage inequality interact with other forms of inequality?
Okay, I think that's a very interesting question, because in reality, in the ILO in particular, we consider that there is not inequality in the singular, there are inequalities, because inequalities can take so many different forms. You have inequality between people who earn a lot of money and those who earn little money, but you have also inequalities between groups. So you can have discrimination against particular groups in the labor market. So you'll see, for example, migrants versus nationals, or also, you have gender inequality, very big issue, of course, in the ILO and in the world, in the modern world, which is inequality between men and women. And so you always have to ask, really, inequality between whom and inequality of what? And in a way, the issue of income inequality is a bit like a prism through which you look at the topic of inequalities, but behind there are many different inequalities. So wage inequality is correlated with other forms of inequalities. If you have a low wage, you're also likely to not have access to social security. You may have no social protection benefits. You may have no access to health services. And so the wage inequality is often related to many other forms of inequalities, which are also very important.
And presumably, if you are on the wrong side of wage inequality, e.g., you're getting paid less, that would compound other inequalities because essentially wage inequality would mean that you have less disposable income and therefore fewer choices.
Yes, absolutely. That's true. And in fact, we've also observed that in many countries, the growing wage inequality lies at the root of the growing income inequality. And so, when wage inequality becomes bigger in the world of work, then there is also a likelihood that inequality in general becomes bigger. And so these notions are very, very much related. And you see also that people who work in jobs that are very low paid, they also very often struggle to get enough hours of work. So we know that low-paid workers often work part-time, and so they struggle on many different fronts. And the wage inequality is just one part of the problem that they face.
I've read that developing economies seem to have greater income and wage inequality. Is that actually the case, or is that just a myth?
No, that is true. We've looked at inequalities in all or income inequality in all our member states, at least those who have data. And in general, it is true that income inequality is even higher in emerging and low income countries than it is in more advanced countries. And some countries like South Africa and or Brazil are quite extreme in that regard. In South Africa, we know that the the highest 10% of income earners earn about two-thirds of the country's total income. So you can imagine the extent of the inequality. In Brazil, it's also about 60%. In a country like France, it would be more like 30 or 35%. So it is true that inequality tends to be higher in developing countries. This being said, we've also observed in recent times that inequality has increased in a lot of the more advanced countries.
Why is that?
Well, one part of the story is more wage inequality. Another part of the story is higher returns to capital for people who have a lot of savings. And it's also interesting to see that more and more the people with high wages are also the people with a lot of capital. And so somehow a lot of the benefits of past economic growth has accrued to people at the top of the pyramid. We've also seen that inequality has increased both between and within enterprises. So within enterprises, you see more dispersion, at least in Europe and in the US. And you have also more inequality between enterprises. You have some top star enterprises who are doing extremely well, and then you have 80% or even more of enterprises which struggle to actually make a margin. And so that form of inequality has also been one of the reasons behind that trend.
Is there also an association between very fast economic growth, which in many cases, but not always, is associated with developing economies, and the levels of income and wage equality or inequality?
Yes, there's even some academic theories that that propose the idea that when countries develop, there will inevitably be some growing inequality because a country doesn't grow in all its sector at the same time, and so you tend to have some sectors which emerge, which become modern, high tech, and where productivity is very high, and so those minority of people working in those sectors start to earn higher wages and higher incomes, while the others are left behind for a while. And so in developing countries, you have the coexistence between a modern part of the economy and a large informal economy, which inevitably means inequality. But there is a more recent research showing that this is not necessarily the case. That it always happens like this. That if you have a good education systems and if you have inclusive policies, that you can have fast economic growth in a way that ensures a fair distribution of the benefits of growth. And so there is no inevitability in the increase in inequality linked to economic growth. And I would even say now that a lot of the recent studies also look at the reverse relationship, is that when you have too much inequality, you will have slower economic growth, because we need that. We know that if you want to grow solidly as a country, you need to have a solid middle class with people who have money to spend and to buy the goods and services that are produced in the country. And so a solid middle class also requires, some sort of equitable distribution. And when you don't have that, then ultimately your economic growth may slow down and become less sustainable.
Because presumably, if people have no spare income, they can't invest in things like their own SMEs or in education for themselves or their kids, and therefore provide the next generation of businesses and workers with a higher skill set.
That's also true, and that there's also, of course, the whole issue of investments in the skills and education of your children. When you're poor, it's very difficult. Whereas when the wealth is more broadly spread, then countries tend to have higher levels of what is called human capital, and and that's where a more equitable and balanced and robust economy can also emerge with enterprises and small enterprises which have relatively high productivity. And so there is a connection between equity and faster economic growth.
And of course, I mean, I think we should bring out here, and this is something you touched on earlier, that we're not simply here talking about how much money people have or may not have in their pockets, but um, inequality knocks on into things like social stability and the long term ability of economies to grow and to provide a workforce for specific sectors, and also into things like health and long and length of life, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That's the idea of having social cohesion when you have an equitable distribution of income and wages, more or less equitable, but you have people who feel they belong to the same country, to the same society. You don't have a sense of people live on different planets or in different bubbles. and that social cohesion is really very important when it comes to economic development and the development of also of social security, social protection systems, and it's also linked to the issue of trust. When people don't trust each other, you don't have a well functioning economy, and it can go much further than that, of course.
Yeah.
That when you have highly unequal societies, you tend to have much more crime, you tend to have much more violence. And if we go to the very extreme of that thinking, we come back to the reason why the ILO was created in the first place, because the ILO's creation was based on the idea that you need social justice in order to have peace in the world. And that's an idea that we would be well inspired to remember a bit more frequently on these days.
And now you've been looking at some of the effects of the pandemic, the COVID crisis, on wage inequality. What were some of the things that you found?
Well, indeed, we've been publishing the Global Wage Report, which has looked on this issue, and others in the ILO have looked on this issue too. The ILO Monitor has been looking at this issue, and I think it's clear that first of all, a lot of the people who lost their jobs during COVID are disproportionately low wage workers, because the high wage workers had more possibility to carry on working from home, to do what we call the teleworking from home, and also because some of the sectors that closed, like restaurants and hotels, employ a disproportionate number of workers with low pay. And so, in that sense, it's quite clear that the pandemic has further increased inequality, especially wage inequality. When you include all the people who suddenly earn zero wages, there's clearly been an unequal impact of the crisis. It's been also the case from the perspective of gender inequality, because many women have been affected by the lockdowns and the closure of sectors where they were overrepresented. And so it's very important that when we think of the recovery, we keep those inequalities in mind, because there can be no human-centered recovery if the recovery is a very unequal recovery, which further deepens pre-existing inequalities.
I mean, no lasting and stable recovery anyway. So let's talk a bit about what can be done about wage inequality, and indeed income inequality, and some of the tools. I mean, let me start off with one idea that's bandied around quite a lot, which is that of minimum wages. What role do you think minimum wages play in reducing wage inequality?
They play a very important role. Minimum wages is a legal tool to ensure that there is a minimally acceptable level of wages that is being paid in the economy, to ensure that workers can actually live together with their families in a decent way as a result of the work that they carry out. And so we see that more and more countries have come around to this idea that minimum wage is actually a very useful tool to reduce wage inequality, but to ensure also that those people at the bottom of the pyramid earn some decent level of wages and incomes. 90% of ILO member states do have minimum wage systems in place. Sometimes they don't work as well as they could. Sometimes they don't cover vulnerable groups of workers, like domestic workers or others. Sometimes they are set at a level that is too low. But 90% of countries have minimum wages, and the ILO is working with a lot of countries to actually improve the minimum wage systems. Of course, it has to be said that in order to be very effective, these systems need to be well designed, set at the right adequate level, either by governments or through collective bargaining. But there also needs to be decent levels of compliance. And that is sometimes very difficult in developing countries which have very large informal economies. And so the informal economy is a challenge to the effectiveness of minimum wages. And so minimum wage is best looked at not as a single individual tool, but as one in as one policy in a set of policies that can be more inclusive and reduce inequalities.
Yeah, because if I was going to put the argument against that, I would say to you that minimum wages can lead to the export of jobs to lower wage areas or countries. They can maybe increase the size of the black market in labour by pushing people out of the formal labour market, and they're a constraint on small businesses.
Yes, that's true. If you, and particularly if you set the minimum wage at a level that is too high, which does and doesn't take into account the economic realities of the country itself, and so minimum wage fixing is a delicate balance between the needs of workers and their families and economic factors and affordability, because we need sustainable enterprises to create jobs and to create decent jobs. So, we always call for very cautious approaches to minimum wages based on evidence and taking into account different factors and different perspectives, and to set in place monitoring systems to see what happens once the minimum wage is increased or established. And if there is a sense that the minimum wage hurts job growth or competitiveness, then there is maybe a need to look into the system again. This being said, the recent Nobel Prize was handed over to David Card, who is an economist who's done a lot of work on minimum wages, and it was shown that when the minimum wage is set at an adequate level, it tends to not have any negative effect on employment. Minimum wages also gives money into the pockets of people who are going to spend it, and that is something that we often forget in these economic models, which are sometimes a bit too simplistic.
So obviously, it's a delicate and subtle tool. Um, just run us through quickly a few of the other tools that are around for dealing with this wage inequality, because obviously it's a kind of basket, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's only through a combination of several tools that you end up being able to reduce wage inequality in a substantial manner. And collective bargaining and wage bargaining is certainly perhaps the most important instrument, because it's a way of ensuring that productivity gains are reflected in wage gains. That when there is, when an enterprises or sector is doing well, then there is a possibility for everybody who is engaged in that enterprise or in the sector, all the workers, to receive a fair share of the fruits of progress. And that's also what helps create a strong middle class, which has a good purchasing power and is able to sustain the economy. So collective bargaining, I think, is a tool which needs to be used. Otherwise, you will have a minimum wage and lots of people at the minimum wage, and tend to have very polarized wage distributions.
And what about things like equal pay initiatives and pay transparency initiatives, or indeed legislation? What about things like that?
Absolutely, very important as well, and in particular when it comes to the issue of eliminating the gender pay gap, we have calculated that across the world, globally, women are paid about 20% less than men, and we've also been looking at why this is the case. And in the past, there was a lot of assumption or arguments that it was because women have lower levels of educations, or they have less skills and or less training. But that's not the main reason anymore. What we found is that there is an element, of course, that is impossible to explain and perhaps relates to discrimination. Certainly, there is discrimination in the labor market, There is also occupational segregation, with women working in some particular occupations and men in other occupations. And so there is a tendency to undervalue these occupations. And that's also been the case in particular of the health sector, when it's been very visible during the times of COVID. And so equal pay initiatives and laws, and also initiatives to ensure pay transparency can be very helpful in that regard. So these are some of the tools. Then you have also the issue of the public sector pay, how people are paid in the public sector, how wages of people are protected, ensuring that people are being paid on a regular basis every month or so. All these are elements which can be used in order to promote an equitable distribution of wages. But then, of course, underlying this, there's also the issue of skills and education. We have to make sure that we have that vulnerable groups have access to education, because without education in the modern world in which we work, it is very difficult to get a very productive jobs. And I think that will be the case more and more in the future, where without being able to handle technology, you will be penalized in the job market.
Yep, it's obviously a very complicated and difficult issue to resolve, inequality. But Patrick, thank you very much for taking us through that. That was Patrick Belser, senior economist and wage expert at the ILO. And that's all we have time for in this edition of the ILO's Future of Work podcast. Please join us again soon for another discussion on key questions on the future of work. Goodbye.